And do people use the chat throughout okay.
I would imagine so.
Brian, it's 9 o'clock and we think we have everyone on here, so why don't we kick it off?
Yeah. All right, let's do it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Brian Scarpelli. I'm with a not-for-profit trade association called ACT, the App Association. This is IGF session 330, the future of work from home, internet governance post-COVID. So I can provide a very brief description here. Before I do that, maybe just a couple of logistical notes. Sorry. A couple logistical notes. We are really excited to have all of the attendees here, and I see the number growing, which is excellent. Want to make sure that we are responsive to your questions and everything. Please use the Q&A function along the bottom. You know, if you look along the bottom bar there, you'll see the functions for your audio, your video, your Q&A, one called Q&A, that is, and if you just use that, we will keep an eye out and make sure to incorporate your questions and answer them. I don't believe that there's any, this will be recorded. The session is hosted under the Internet Governance Forum Code of Conduct and United Nations Rules and Regulations. Should mention that. There is a chat feature here. It's for social chat. Again, please use the Q&A function to ask questions for this panel. Don't think I'm forgetting anything else logistical there. Thanks again. So back to the content here, a brief description that I can give before I'll turn it over, introduce very briefly and turn it over to the panelists. But again, our session title is The Future of Work from Home, Internet Governance Post-COVID. It's very clear that the concept of work is among many of the things that will likely never return to normal due to the coronavirus pandemic, even after it fully subsides. So while many employers within the information economy have scrambled to formalize their work from home policies to adhere to social distancing measures at the outset, some sectors are even less familiar with remote work, such as retail and things like that, and are increasingly experimenting with online-only operations. As more organizations are becoming accustomed to these arrangements and seek to reduce costs over the long term, telework is very likely to enjoy increased adoption across the economy. So as with all large-scale societal shifts, this new arrangement will generate new classes of winners and losers, while some white-collar workers, as they're called, will enjoy greater flexibility and freedom in their work arrangements. Others may not be so lucky, and the migration of retail and other service sector operations to online could hurt workers already vulnerable to economic hardship, including those with less digital skills or educational opportunities. So work from home arrangements also raise questions about how employers will measure employee productivity and whether those efforts may entail harmful extensions of workplace surveillance. Lots of issues. More work conducted over the internet also enhances the opportunity for cyber attack, can lead to new privacy risks. So our goal here today with this panel, which is to discuss the evolution in the digital economy, how the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated some of those trends, and the ways in which internet governance will need to evolve to keep pace with these new norms. And the panel is also intended to assess solutions, of course, to the equity, privacy, security, and other concerns that I've just mentioned, and others. I know that we should state some of these expected outcomes. You'll find these in the session overview that's posted publicly on the IGF site, but very briefly, I'll make sure to mention those. One, to understand the spectrum of advantages and disadvantages that a movement towards telework will bring to bear on communities during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, and how these advantages and disadvantages may be mediated by socioeconomic factors. Two, learn about what the IGF community can do to further action and cross-sector collaboration to realize the potential and work through challenges surfaced in this conversation. And three, share diverse perspectives and spur action regarding the discrete priorities and challenges that and action to address them needed from the IGF community to combat the same challenges and to take advantage of the at the same time take advantage of the interesting opportunities. So that's our session overview. I think very briefly, I just can introduce our session panelists, and then I can turn it over to them to give some opening remarks. But I'm very pleased to be joined by this diverse group of experts. Karen Coker, Global General Manager, Talent and Learning Experiences and Workforce of the Future with Microsoft. Alani Galpaya, CEO of LIRNE Asia, Learn Asia. Becca Williams, Principal Consultant and Owner at Thought Distillery, and Carmel Summers with a Human Capital Strategist with Technology Ireland ICT SkillNet. So I believe the order we were going to go in would have you first, Karen, if that's okay, and I can turn it over to you for just some introductory remarks, opening thoughts, and then we can do the same for panelists.
Sure, of course. Happy to do it, Brian. And welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to join this distinguished group and have a conversation with you all about workforce of the future and the future of working from home and all that entails in terms of opportunities and potentially challenges. As Brian mentioned, I am here representing Microsoft. And at Microsoft, I have the opportunity to do a whole variety of bodies of work in talent and learning broadly for our global employee group. Most specifically, for the conversation here today, I have the accountability for Microsoft's future of work and the workplace of the future. So our work recently, of course, with COVID on people being able to take more opportunity to work in a hybrid manner and in a much more flexible manner is something that my team and I have been, of course, paying very close attention to and having a very significant focus on. And so what I thought I would start with is honestly just a few comments to give a sense since March, when Microsoft had all of its global employees begin to work in a much more hybrid and flexible way. Similar to most companies, we've gone through quite an evolution of skills and mindsets and activities, as you can imagine. At the center of that all along has been our commitment to our culture. And I think many of you have probably read over the years of the cultural transformation that Microsoft has been working through. And that culture has been front and center in every decision that we've made as we've moved more into this hybrid, flexible way of working. And that's not just for our employees, it's also keeping the communities that we live in and that we serve also top of mind as we make decisions and we progress. And I think the other couple of points to make people aware of is, as we've worked our way through these changes, as a technology company, of course, we're very committed to innovation, but we're also really focused on, to the extent we possibly can, as Kathleen Hogan, our Chief Human Resource Officer, likes to say, we're working our way to try to get to yes with each and every one of our employees. Because as Brian opened and said, everybody around the world is in a unique situation. Whether it's because you have children learning at home at the same time you're trying to work, or it may be because you're taking care of a family member, everybody has a unique situation. And so we need to understand those unique situations. And then as much as we possibly can, get as close to yes for what is best for that employee as we possibly can. And so using some of these principles as our anchors, that's how we have been organizing ourselves for this future of work, and specifically our hybrid flexible work right now with COVID. And happy to discuss that in more detail as we go forward. But Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kalani.
Thanks, Brian. So I run a think tank called Learn Asia, and we work in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and a lot of times we work with our partners in Latin America and Africa. And we worry about people who still are not connected, who might be marginalized, and so on. So in terms of working at home, there is not a whole lot of systematic evidence on what happened during the pandemic. We ourselves are in the process of commissioning some nationwide surveys in India and Sri Lanka to understand really what happened to livelihoods, to what extent ICT was used, and so on. The more systematic studies, the latest one, I think, is the one put out by the World Bank, which follows up on some of the other studies done by several other researchers, which basically looks at OECD countries. So it does involve some developing countries, but Mexico, for example, but it's majority the big and the rich economies of the world. And they do this interesting classification based on, like manual work intensity, face-to-face interactions, the ICT component of work already there is in all these jobs, and then internet availability at home. And the clearest finding is that, broadly speaking, this tracks GDP, right? The workers in poorer countries with lower GDPs are less likely to have jobs that are amenable for working at home. The best performer is Norway, for example, one of the richest countries in the sample. So here we come to the fundamental challenge of internet availability at home. Even if you had a job with high face-to-face internet intensity, which can be done online, and low manual component, that means you don't need to be in a particular location and need machinery and so on, you still need to have decent ICT connectivity at home. And our research, which is quite systematic in this sense, and spans about 23 countries in the global south, the low development level countries, representative of everyone above the age of 15 in all these countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, paints quite a dire picture. While Argentina, Colombia, the richer countries have done well in getting connectivity to households, the Asian and African countries are lagging far, far behind. So we are talking the availability of a working internet connection in India pre-COVID being at about 21% of households. So let's assume with the demand that clearly would have happened because of COVID, it went up to 30% of 35, 40%. Still, that's a large number of households and therefore a large number of individuals who are without connectivity. That's not the only barrier. Obviously, you need a device as well. What we find during the pandemic is many people connecting via a phone, and you need at least a smartphone for a decent, video connectivity. And smartphones pretty much lag behind and trace the number of people. So for example, in a country like Sri Lanka, we're talking about 30 to 40% of everyone over the age of 15 being online. And that's roughly the number of percentage of smartphones. So it really is determined by having access to a good device. If you're looking at availability of laptops, the numbers are incredibly dire. So there's a whole lot of work that cannot be done on a phone and requires a laptop to work at home. The numbers are down to 20%, 4% across all people in India, 3% in Bangladesh, 6% in Nepal. And the numbers are really ridiculously low. So the opportunities, even when you have a job that potentially could do some of it productively at home, you don't have the devices or the connectivity. And the problems with connectivity of not having reliable connectivity are quite serious. And I think later we should get into a whole discussion about who actually has access to these devices and the non-ICT barriers for working at home. But I'll stop my comments here.
Thank you. Becca.
Hi, everyone. I am honored and grateful to be here among such an incredible group of panelists. I'm a small business owner in Colorado in the US. I work with globally distributed software development and product teams as an agile coach, project manager, and analyst. So very hands-on from an implementation perspective. I've been fully remote for 5 years now under a few different scenarios. First, as the only remote employee in my functional area and on my team. I also worked for an organization that was half remote, half co-located, another organization that was fully remote. And now for the last 15 months, I've been a remote independent consultant. So I've experienced remote work pre-COVID from a number of different angles and look forward to sharing more about that. I'm also very passionate about cultivating empowered and authentic teams and mindful, heart-centered leadership. So all of the structures that need to be in place in order for people to do their best work and show up fully. Thank you.
Great. And last but not least, Carmel.
Thanks, Brian. So look, like my fellow panelists, I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to be here today and to be part of this discussion. I'm an organizational psychologist. I worked for IBM for almost 31 years. And I took early retirement last year and I moved to work for a company called Technology Ireland ICT SkillNet. So as an organization, we are, I suppose, chartered to continue upskilling within industry. So it's very much about providing programs to allow industry to flourish. And I'm based in Ireland, and obviously our work is in Ireland as well. But this topic, I guess, is very core to, to what we're doing as an organization, because we're very focused on the future of work. I think to a great extent for a lot of organizations, COVID really was a turning point for them, because I must say I have been working from home in a hybrid model for probably over 10 years. Loved it. Not so much loving it at the minute. And I think that's sort of the same way with a lot of people. So I think it's also it's interesting, because I think it's everything from technology right through to people, to how we lead. It's the culture in our organizations. And then it is the barriers for a lot of people that, maybe the playing field isn't quite so equal anymore. So look, they're kind of my high level thoughts. So I'm really looking forward to this session.
Excellent. Well, thanks. I am, and one more reminder out there to the attendees. It's great to see this strong number, by the way. Thank you all for attending. Please do use that Q&A function. I don't see any questions asked just yet. Don't worry. We've got some to get rolling with here. I guess here's one that I hope is, please anyone jump in and answer and even build on or respond to what other people say. It'd be great to just kind of get the conversation going. Kind of teed up, I think, through everyone's opening remarks, but as the public health crisis has evolved, and we've seen businesses formalize work from home policies more and more, what opportunities does this shift signal to you? What are those harms that we've mentioned, that I think some of which have been mentioned already, need to be mitigated? And do you think this is a trend that will last beyond the public health crisis? Or how much will things return to normal in your view? Kind of several questions there, but anyone, please.
Okay, I guess I'll start, Brian, with that question. Okay, I think in terms of opportunities, some of the initial studies, and for organizations that have had working from home or remote working prior to now, would say the productivity tends to go up. And I suppose that there's a lot of reasons for that. From an employee point of view, and I'm just going to pick a couple so that the other panelists can also chip in. I guess from the employee's point of view, the big thing tends to be flexibility. And do I think this will continue? Absolutely. I think for those organizations that didn't do it before, that now have people who got into the swing of it, like it, I think they'll continue to do it. I mean, there's also, I suppose, that whole fact that, when we've kind of proven it works, there are models for us to continue to do it. And I think that it certainly will continue into next year. And I think most organizations will probably continue to look at it. That would be my cut on it.
And to build off of what Carmel said, I would add, and these are both, in my opinion, opportunities and potential harms, right? So I think just keeping that in mind, I don't know that they fall nicely into one category or the other. But as an example, I completely agree with her that this is going to be a trend that continues. And what we're seeing is it's this integration of work and personal life, right? There is no clear delineation once you start to work in a hybrid flexible model. And I think that that's an opportunity for many people. It does give them that flexibility. It's also a difficult situation for most people to manage. And so well-being really starts to be negatively impacted. It is something that we're already seeing. And so we do a lot on the Microsoft side with workplace analytics. And that is absolutely a trend that we're seeing, is that productivity goes up. Absolutely. People feel good about what they're getting done, but there is a cost to that. And the cost seems to be that blurring of this personal and work line, even more so than maybe it was in the past, and the well-being effects of all that. So I think that's one. Number two is it's back to skills. And so again, an opportunity, but also a challenge. Working in a highly digital way. I mean, we were already on our way through a digital transformation in many, many places around the world. And people were already being challenged by not having the skills potentially that they needed to take advantage of those work opportunities. And so now this is, of course, being exacerbated by this immediate kind of thrust into working more digitally and in a flexible way. And so again, we have a lot that we're doing on the Microsoft side for our own employees and also for other parts of the world to help people realize the skills they need and then help them acquire the skills that they need to be employable as they go into the future, in a more digital future. And so I would say those are two things that really resonate for me. And I'll turn it over to somebody else on the panel.
Brian, if I may come in, I completely agree with Carmel and Karen. I think it's interesting that a lot of these trends that we are seeing are true for, look, the opportunity to work from home, I think, is sometimes a privilege in the rather dangerous health situations that we have, right? So if you look at a lot of low-paid service sector jobs, be it in developing or developed countries, those people are out of work. You can't do a remote haircut, right? So there's a public policy imperative at this point to think through who can work from home, and therefore what are the resources in safeguarding those who cannot work from home. I think that's an important conversation as much as talking about who can work from home, because we need less resources. I'm in this house. All these panelists are in this house, which is arguably a much safer environment. Second, it also privileges certain types of jobs. Not only does it negatively discriminate against sort of low-paid service sector jobs, which cannot be done online most of the time, it highly privileges knowledge work, certain types of creative work, right? So these are already the well-paid people that the research finds that a lot of times, not always, can do a lot of that work online. They're also the ones who are likely to have more ICT components and so on and so forth. There's also a gender component here, I think, and that works across class and economic sort of, privilege, right? I mean, women are working at home with all the other responsibilities a lot of times, while men are just working from home in many situations, right? So there's a fundamental difference in that. And when we looked at, in developing countries, at a certain type of home-based work, which is the purely digital gig work, that is sitting in your house and doing gigs, designing web pages, or ad clicking, or social media marketing, or stuff like that, what we find this interesting cultural phenomena is that this kind of work sometimes pays really well. Often many people are moonlighting while they have some other job that doesn't pay them well. It's unacceptable culturally for men a lot of times to be sitting at home and doing this gig work online, while it is quite acceptable for women to be sitting at home on a computer and doing gig work. Repeatedly, you hear this in ethnographic studies. In part because this allows women to play their traditional role of managing the house, the cooking, the shopping, and all of these other things, right? So the expectation of employers has to really fundamentally shift. If all their workforce or majority of their workforce, men and women, are working from home, and somehow we expect exactly the same level of work and the same kind of productivity. There will be high productivity, but what does productivity mean? How do we set incentives? I mean, all these things I think have to be really rethought.
I agree with what has been said as well. And I would add a couple of more opportunities and harms on the flip side. To the flexibility point, I saw an article last month from National Public Radio that referenced a study from Upwork, which is a freelancing platform, estimating that 14 to 23 million Americans are considering relocating to less expensive areas. So that brings with it some opportunities for the areas where they're relocating to. If there are rural areas that are already served by broadband infrastructure, for example, interesting things can be happening there. On the flip side, as people move out of cities, as some companies are closing their large offices, what's the negative impact on the people who support those efforts? We're also seeing discussions around companies, large ones, that are considering location-based salary adjustments. So for the people who do choose to make those moves, how much of a pay cut will they have to take? And will that make those companies less competitive in the market? It used to be that remote opportunities were prized, and so from an employee perspective, they might be willing to take less because there were fewer opportunities. Now there are many more, so I think companies are going to have to reevaluate. And lastly, I think we're going to be looking at redefining what it means to deliver value. It's not necessarily about sitting in your chair for 40 to 50 hours a week. As it relates to the idea of productivity, how do we think about that differently? Thank you.
Great, all excellent answers. So many interesting threads to pull on there. Thank you all. And it's great to see, one, we have, I think, an interesting question which might help us pull on one of those threads, particularly something you just said, Becca, I think, but was also, I think, theme across what other folks are saying. And to see such a lively chat. It's great to see the engagement, I must say. So one of the audience members asked the following question. I'm curious about the panelists' views on whether this period, and I think he's talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, will have any lasting impact on regulatory support for improved and more widespread residential internet access, and what strategies are likely to be the most impactful for individuals working from home. Maybe that is a very interesting question. Thank you, Chris Buckridge, for asking that. And maybe if I could just add a little bit onto it is you know, fortunately for this conversation too, we have some good diversity amongst our panelists, even geographically. So I'm curious where you are. Have you seen, you know, the government of the country you're in, or or more generally more regional, multi-governmental organizations, anything like that, or other organizations, even non-governmental, you know, focusing on that issue and developments worth sharing, that sort of a thing. That's really fascinating to me. Sorry to add that onto your question there, Chris, but it is a good question. Does anyone want, it wasn't directed at anyone in particular, so I'd love to hear what anyone would like to say to that.
Can I give sort of the unhelpful answer? That is, I think, you know, doing things once the pandemic hits to worry about, you know, who has access, oh my goodness, how do we improve it, is a bit too late, right? I mean, I come from a part of the world where proper deregulation of markets and high levels of competition have got more people connected than anything else, right? So allowing competition into the market is the key. Now, having said that, the fact that internet access in Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan often comes out at the most affordable end of all league tables, almost every year, right? And yet, under 30% of the population is connected. So there's a lot more going on than just having connectivity, which we've done pretty well. Having affordable connectivity, which we've done reasonably well. I mean, of course, if you look at every income decile, you will find it's still relatively unaffordable. But overall, if you look at aggregate numbers, it's incredibly affordable as a percentage of GNI, and yet people are not online. So the other environmental factors, whether it is skill or whether it is high quality, whether it is seeing the salience of having an internet connectivity. I mean, the responses we get from people who've never used the internet in the countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are along the lines of, I've never heard of the internet. That's a huge percentage of people who answer that question as the main reason you've never used internet or social media. Second, I don't see the need for it. Somewhere third in Asia comes, I can't afford it. Somewhere slightly higher in Africa. So the reasons are really quite multiple. So obviously this sort of kickstart we got from the pandemic and the need to be online, particularly for children's education more than anything else, at least to be on WhatsApp to get your assignments, would drive a lot of internet adoption. Thanks.
And I think I'd add to that in the context that I do think governments need to do more in terms of broadband and internet access. And I think it's not just to support the working from home, but one of the things that this showed up certainly in Ireland was how many businesses weren't online. So just from the world is changing, everything is going digital, and businesses need to actually have a presence online, and to have a presence online, you need to be able to support it. So I think it also goes beyond just the working from home piece in that context.
Yes, and this is not my area of expertise, but I do know in the United States, as an example, I think many people assume that we have, terrific internet connectivity and access because we're a very developed country and, quite a wealthy one in comparison to many. And yet we have a lot of people out in the rural areas that have previously been underserved or unserved or underserved as it relates to internet access. And I know Microsoft, we have an initiative, and we're not unique. I think there are other companies that have initiatives as well around the world, but we have an initiative called Airband. And so through the Airband program over the past several years, we've been able to put about 1.2 million people on the internet in these rural underserved areas throughout the country. So I think governments absolutely need to do all they can. And at the same time, I think corporations have some accountability as well to help and improve the situation for people. And so at least speaking for Microsoft, that's what we've been doing in order to try to help people that otherwise wouldn't have access and therefore wouldn't have opportunity.
I'm based in Colorado in the US, and I've been digging into broadband availability lately. This is not my area of expertise either, but what I'm finding is just the number of agencies that play a role in that availability is fascinating. Department of Regulatory Affairs, Department of Local Affairs, State Broadband Commission. As I dig more, as a homeowner considering a relocation, I'm not sure where to start. So I don't know if things are going to bubble up to the higher levels or if it's going to go top down. I agree that it's absolutely important to get everyone connected, and the fact that so many people are even considering relocating does come from a place of privilege.
Great. Well, thank you all. This is really excellent. We've gotten a number of questions here, and I just want to make sure that I read it in the most helpful way here. So maybe this would be something, and Carmel, maybe this is a interesting. I wonder what maybe you and others might think about this. Again, this question was just, I think, directed to the entire panel, so you may all have a perspective here. But I was just thinking about your credentials and stuff with this, and something that you mentioned in your opening remarks, I believe. One question here is essentially saying, when people work from home, don't we lose needed contact with others? And this is important to achieve work success. And I know several of you mentioned this. So I would guess that your answer is probably yes, but maybe is that an understated aspect here with working from home trends? I mean, this is almost getting to a mental health and satisfaction, and even satisfaction, which I know Karen, you mentioned too at the beginning. So I don't know. Does anyone want to expand on that? I do think it's an interesting thought that someone shared in the Q&A function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I could. Oh, Karen, do you want to go?
No, go right ahead, Carmel. I'll follow you.
Okay. Look, I think it is actually fundamental. I think as human beings, we are very much wired for social interaction, and that social interaction tends to be, we need more of the physical social interaction. I mean, look, what we're doing today is great, and it is, it's great. We can build relationships, we can have a conversation, but it doesn't get away from the fact that at the end of the day, part of why we go into a physical location for work is that we actually, it's those impromptu meetings in the corridors. It's that ability to, to grab somebody and go for a cup of coffee. And there's that social piece that is about that physical closeness that actually sort of fulfills us in a lot of different ways, emotionally, intellectually. And I think and I've seen it because I've gone from that hybrid work environment where I went into the office 3 days a week, and I worked from home full time 2 days a week. And I don't like, because I said it up front, I don't like this away from work. I want to get back to that hybrid, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think that whoever actually raised that question, it is huge. That whole area is huge. And it is very fundamental. It's also very fundamental to the culture of our organization. So whatever organization we work for, a big piece of our kind of come to work, feel good, like about the organization is how people interact, and it's how the organization works, and it's how we meet and how we collaborate. And it's not saying you can't do that remotely, but I'm not sure yet how we get this balance of that connectivity around the social piece. I think it's a huge area for cultures, for organizations. And while we can kind of understand it and maybe even able to move forward if people all worked in an environment before COVID, but think about the person you're going to hire into your organization in 6 months or 8 months time if you're going to be either all fully remote. So how do they even get that first experience in an organization where maybe the manager walks them around to introduce them to some people? And if that manager meets people on the way, it's some of those interactions that happen that are not planned, that we see, that we kind of get a sense of, oh, it's a friendly organization. And, gosh, the manager actually asked that person about how their kid got on at soccer practice. But it's those nuances that you pick up in that physical environment as you go around. And I mean, culture grows over time and culture builds over time. But I think this is a huge question, and probably one that you could do a whole session on for hours. So I'll leave it at that, because I know Karen actually wants to come in behind me there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that, what we're seeing, and just based on the thought leadership out there as well. So there's a lot of studies that are underway at this point, and some that have already been concluded and have some really interesting insights. But it seems to be that you have to think about this from a variety of perspectives. And so what I mean by that is, yes, social cohesion is a big deal, right? It's like, how do you help people in a hybrid, flexible environment still develop and maintain the necessary levels of social cohesion with all the right people and groups, right? And so that you have to be very purposeful about that. And I think that may be the lesson in all of this, right? Is it has to be very purposeful. The other thing that has to be very purposeful is, how do you give people or encourage people to take unplugged reflection time, right? Because what we're finding is people are getting online at really early times of the day, and they're working online all the way through the evening. They don't have any time at all. Matter of fact, most of us are putting ourselves, like, you take yourself off video just for 5 minutes to run to the kitchen to get lunch, right? Or to grab a water. And so you truly have no downtime. And so all of this just kind of happens, right? And so what we're beginning to see really clearly is you really do have to be very purposeful about there is a need to build in some sort of social cohesion. There is a need to build in unplugged reflection time. And there's a need to make clear to people, why are they joining? Is it a brainstorming activity? Is it just a more passive activity? And you need to make sure people can prepare, and that the organizing framework for the opportunity supports what you're trying to achieve, right? So there's so many things, but we were all thrust in this. And so I think people are doing quite well given the circumstances. But now as we think about this being a long-term play, I think that's where we have to go about it in much more of a planful way, taking all of those. And for example, at Microsoft, we have our managers working on what we call team agreements. And so all managers at Microsoft have been given tools so that they can sit down with their teams and come up with these team agreements. And the team agreements will include, as an example, when are we going to have our team meetings, making it clear that everybody needs to participate in the team meetings. As we go forward and we can be more hybrid, where people will be in the workplace, which meetings do you need to come to face, right? And again, being very planful about those should be the difference maker meetings where you are trying to form this social cohesion. And so we're asking managers to be very thoughtful about this, do it quite far in advance of when they'll be expected to work in that way. Again, so it's not a last minute, things are just kind of done because they need to be done, but it is very purposeful to get the outcomes that we all want and need.
Can I jump in, Brian? Carmel, I love your point about unplanned interactions, and Karen, your emphasis on being purposeful. I absolutely agree. I think something that can work really well for the organizations that choose to stay fully remote or close to it is investing in bringing everyone together 2 or 3 times a year. I think it's absolutely worth the investment to create those spaces for those face-to-face interactions. For me personally, it's been a fluctuation over time. Initially, I was fearful about being remote. I thought I was going to hate it. After that, I'm like, remote is the only way. This is the future. And then a couple of years in, I felt that loneliness that people often experience. And I found that I had to rebuild my sense of community outside of work. As someone who always tied my identity very closely to the work that I did, I just had to reinvent how I reconnected with community, and it became local and getting out more within the surrounding area to find those kinds of connections that I was missing with remote work. I've also found, though, that there have been some cases where I've felt closer to remote colleagues than in-person colleagues. So there are some interesting things that can happen when the structure is there. Back to Karen's point about being purposeful.
Great. Okay. Well, I have a question of my own here, a targeted one, and I do see at least 4 other questions that have come in. So I can take a look at those here to see if one kind of naturally follows up or something like that. But, you know, a question for you, Karen. Would you be able to share just maybe some more about how Microsoft as an organization has dealt with the public health crisis, the posture of the company with respect to telework, and you know what's next after the? I don't think it's controversial to say that right now is an acute phase of the pandemic. It seems globally, which is, I hate to have to say that, but it does seem. You know, that it is, unfortunately, and that passes ideally soon. You know, what that might mean permanently for an organization like yours.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, Brian. I mean, you know, as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft, of course, we went to this hybrid, flexible workplace back in March, right? So, like many people around the world, in the March timeframe was when much of this started. And we now will be on a path from a corporate standpoint to be in this hybrid, flexible situation, really, to Brian's point, forever, right? I mean, we anticipate this will go on for the future. And so even after all of our countries are locations are back to COVID stage 6, which means they're able to be in the workplace and do so safely. We anticipate that many employees will be still taking advantage of a hybrid flexible work situation. And so right now, though, through July 6th, for the Microsoft Corporation, people will be working largely from home unless they're an essential worker in an essential worker category. And so we do have the whole company having to get better at being hybrid flexible workers together. So it goes back to the previous question on, how do we do that and do it in a way that people are not only productive, but they're satisfied and well, right, doing it. So our process so far, as I mentioned, we have employees in 120 countries. And so we've tried to be as local about all of this as we possibly can. Right. And that means, working with the country policies, the country norms, the country cultures, et cetera. At the same time, of course, wanting people and the communities to be safe. And so that's first and foremost, right, trying to be local about it. And then I mentioned the other mindset that we're operating within, which is this getting to yes. Because again, whether it's because of the country type situation or an individual's unique needs, there are so many unique circumstances to take into consideration that we can't possibly make corporate policies that align to everybody. And so what we've tried to do is put in place a small number of corporate-wide policies and instead lean in towards more local and more individualized circumstances and approaches. And that mindset of getting to yes has been one that we're really very focused on. But from a corporate perspective, we have, I think you probably have seen, there's a really good blog online, if you haven't taken a look, from Kathleen Hogan, who's Microsoft's Chief Human Resource Officer. And in there, she talks about this spirit and mindset that we're working with. But also she talks about how every employee at Microsoft, unless you're in a rare category where your role for some reason cannot be done virtually, but the large majority of Microsoft employees for the future will be able to work less than 50% of their time from home. And that's everybody. And that was a position that we took about 3 or so weeks ago. I think it was on October 7th is when we made that announcement to our employees and then publicly. And so as an example, that puts us in a situation where, yes, of course, for COVID, that's essential for health and safety. Beyond COVID, we believe it's simply essential to deliver people a better way of balancing their work and family and home needs and situations. And people want the flexibility. So less than 50% of the time, employees can simply work from home. They don't have to ask permission. Again, unless they're in a rare category that they can't work from home, but that's a very small number. And so that's just an example. And so we are now adjusting ourselves, of course, the technology that we use, the way we use it, the way we organize our teams, the team agreements that I mentioned to you. There are just so many aspects that have to be thought about and worked through. And it's a big change management effort, as I'm sure you can all imagine, and the same for your own organizations. And so we have a lot of change management plans that we're starting to work through, helping managers have the right mindset for working with their employees in this new and different way of working, make sure people have the skills that they'll need, make sure that people have the technology and the access that they need, make sure they have the right home office setups, if that's something that they're going to take advantage of more than 50% of the time, which there is the possibility of people having more than 50% of that. That is, manager approval has to be involved there. So we've got a whole organized way of thinking through this and working through it. But what I find interesting and I think necessary that we should all collaborate on is that need to basically reimagine, as Becca said, right? Reinvent and reimagine. And through that reinvention and that reimagining, then begin to identify what do we need to do? How do we help people skill and get the right mindset and et cetera? And so we're trying to now be very planful and purposeful about that for the future. So I'll lay that as the groundwork and then I'll let others jump in.
Karen, I find this so fascinating. I'd love to see the data in like 2 to 4 years on what this does to who stays in the workforce and who doesn't, because we know one of the primary reasons a lot of women drop off, for example, right, because of caring responsibilities and so on. I mean, I run a much smaller organization that has always had flexible work as an option, and the only people who ask for it are women, and usually women with children or caring responsibilities. And in fact, once we've all gone remote, because it's a regional organization, so we're quite used to working with people online, but I find in Colombo, the people who are clamoring to come back into office after curfew are the men with children. So love to see like proper, systematic data, given how big Microsoft is. That'll be amazing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Alani. I mean, right, we're it's so early. I mentioned we just announced it on October 7th. And so it is absolutely a work in progress. And we're not promoting this as the answer, right? Because to your point, we don't have the data. We are simply saying this is the decision that we made that we think is best for Microsoft and our employees and the communities that we're part of. And over time, we will see, how this works and where we need to evolve from here. And I do like in the chat box, somebody mentioned it all does bring us back to the Internet Global Forum. And the reason we're all here is it does require internet connectivity, for people to be able to do this. And so I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to add more about what they see as the evolution in that area that really does need to coincide with these opportunities that we're talking about.
Yeah, Karen, I would just add to that. I'll actually cover that question that you've raised in one little piece. But what I really wanted to acknowledge is the fact that what you're doing as an organization, most organizations need to do. In fact, all organizations need to do. I think we can't just assume that this working from home thing is almost just the new normal without putting some focus on it. And one of the big things by doing that is that it's driven from the top down. And I think with working from home, I think it needs to see, that leaders walk the talk with it, so that you have that scenario where, if I decide after all this COVID thing is gone and my organization gives me the ability to work from home and I decide to do that I won't have a manager somewhere that really is kind of online at, 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, and that I'm following that sort of culture, because it kind of breaks the whole sentiment around doing this. And I think you do kind of have to get into it. You do have to plan it. So, it's just great to see that you're doing that. In terms of the importance of the internet and connectivity, absolutely. But the other thing I think is that when organizations look to do this, and organizations like Microsoft and many others out there across sectors, they have a voice that actually may get this internet situation resolved or close to resolved, because it's going to be important for countries to be competitive, not just for different businesses to be competitive, but it's in everybody's interest, both society and citizens as well as organizations, to be able to. So I think it may help to drive that connectivity when, especially when there is a voice coming from industry as well, saying, not that there hasn't been all along, but there's a bigger push now because of the scenario that we've ended up in with COVID.
May I add just one more point, which is, while we talked a lot about sort of people like us and knowledge workers who can work, digitally, there's a lot of manual production work that can really benefit from the kind of digital connectivity and integration into digitally connected value chains, So this point I think Kamal is making about better internet connectivity being so fundamental, so that, people who are, even if you are doing a business from home, which has to do with garment manufacturing or handicrafts or production of food, we know increasingly how much they have relied on digital platforms. Digital payments is another thing, particularly for women and home-based workers to be able to actually continue to work, right? So the fact that PayPal is not allowed in some countries is such a fundamental challenge to actually getting paid on a platform. Instead of paying 14%, you're paying much bigger commissions to cash out your money. So there are a whole lot of other non-digital, sort of the analog complements that actually also have to work to make this realistic for not just purely digital workers, but even for physical manufacturing, location-specific workers who also can move part of their value chains online.
Great. Thank you all. So we had, I was just looking at the questions we had come in, and Helani, this may be a question for you, at least to start. And I'm trying to kind of take two different questions and kind of put them into one. But essentially, one of the questions was observing about how, you know, before before work travel was more or less nixed widely, that that businesses would provide, you know, subsidies, support for expenses when someone was traveling. How does that translate into at all into, I mean, I realize it's something we talked about a bit already, but how does that translate into the future that we're talking about? And I'm trying to mix that with another question. This is why I thought of Learn Asia and where you mentioned you're doing work, Helani, what this means for developing as well as developed countries. I apologize. I realize that's a little bit of an open-ended question there, but I thought that they were two interesting themes that kind of came in through the Q&A function here.
Sure. I mean, I'll make a small contribution and I'm sure others can jump in. It is absolutely true that in many developing countries, the allowances, for example, for travel are a huge part of the compensation compared to your monthly salary. So the moment you stop traveling for work daily, let's say under pandemic conditions, you lose the allowance. And that actually is a really important part of your living wage. So that is a challenge and that's a reality. I mean, obviously, the way we think about it is while you may not need to buy your train ticket or what have you, you still need to obviously have digital connectivity. You will need, you know, software to secure yourself and work in a particular way. Now, going further, you may also, if you're spending 12 hours a day on video calls, need that same kind of office chair that we provided, but at home. So there's a whole lot of shifting of those benefits that was simply targeted as travel and very easily, you know, paid off by employers because there are tax implications that are better for both parties and so on. They really do now need to shift, right? And I'm not sure whether, for example, our accounting teams are ready to handle that the way these, you know, these capital assets are depreciated if you give a table and whatever for working at home, as opposed to a monthly, you know, payment for travel. But I don't think this is rocket science. You can still keep people, you know, sort of possibly at a similar level of employment, similar level of productivity, as long as you're willing to shift and rethink what it is that their space at home is subsidizing, for example, what part of that you should pay for, and so on and so forth.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Look, oops, sorry there. Well, I wondered, Becca, if I could ask you a question here. I know just kind of building on everything we've talked about so far, it's been great discussion. But in your experience in working with globally distributed teams, including teams that are likely working to build solutions to some of the challenges that we're discussing here today. You know, what I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on or dig into a little bit some of the best practices for you know, that for successful remote working environments that you've seen.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, would love to. I think a lot of them actually mirror what we would see in any healthy co-located organization. So I think a number of things are not specific to remote work. And I think we've also covered a number of things, and we've got the philosophical and then we have the tactical implementation level pieces. From a philosophical perspective, I think it speaks a lot to what Karen was talking about in terms of getting to yes, just remembering that we're all whole people. We are parents, we're caregivers, we're partners, we are animal lovers, activists, gamers, you know, keeping that whole person-centered view in mind. It's no longer a matter of the compartmentalized employee. You know, work is here and home is here. As others have mentioned, those lines are very blurry now. So I think starting with the philosophy is important. from a tactical perspective, having the tools and processes in place. So making sure that there's a solid structure for collaboration, whether that's communication asynchronously, so chat tools like Slack, and I'll give a plug for Microsoft Teams because I love that too. I think they both work really well. Collaborating on documents and other digital assets, making sure, I've seen a lot of hiccups around not having clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So I think that's super important too. A lot of time can be wasted when that is not in place. And I think it's important to work with employees to craft those roles and responsibilities. So it's not a matter of just handing them over and saying, here you go. It's how can we work through this together so that there's that sense of ownership and buy-in, making sure that people know where to go and who to go for answers. So having a solid internal knowledge base is important. Open and transparent communications, weekly one-on-ones between managers and direct reports. I think things like that and team building activities can quickly go to the wayside when there isn't always an immediately tangible benefit, but there are absolutely long-term benefits. I have other thoughts. I'll stop myself there. I could talk about this for a really long time. I'd love to hear from other panelists.
Great. Yeah, if anyone else does want to add on to that, please do. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I think Becca pretty much covered all the things. I think that some of the biggest things are, when you talk about communication, almost better to over communicate than under communicate in this environment. And another thing that I've seen work is, where you set up a space for people to be able to work themselves together. So to kind of encourage that those teams to come together, and that it's not always manager driven. I think a certain amount of it is, and Becca covered things like weekly one-to-ones. They're so important that employees don't feel that now they've been forgotten about because they're outside of the office, but almost encouraging the teams to sort of to self-team, to come together in groups, to schedule their own meetings or their own sessions as needed. And something we started doing as an organization, and I literally joined ICT SkillNet at the start of March, and my first day to meet the whole team was the day that we actually shut the office for lockdown for COVID back in March. And there was a suggestion came out about a week later that we would have a coffee morning every Friday from 11 to 11:30. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, for God's sake, how does this actually work? So the skeptic who would be pro communication kind of went into this thinking, that's great if we're all sitting together, but I just didn't really, this online thing of doing it. It's still going. I don't work Fridays, and I still go on a Friday, unless I literally have something else that I can't go to it. But it has actually worked. We don't talk about work. And it's amazing how we've actually managed to get to know one another through that. So I think there's lots of different ways that we need to pull communication together. And then that's just a couple of thoughts to follow on from Becca.
Well, yeah, and the only other thing that I would add is, I also do think that this whole notion of how to help people be unplugged, there's some themes here in the chat where, I think right now it seems as if we're so online oriented, right? That everything is now being done online, and we don't seem to be good at deciding what activities really don't have to be done online, right? And so this whole notion of unplugged reflection time, or maybe the need to have more of a conversation, like pick up the phone and call someone. Everything doesn't have to be a video, right? And this, because I think it gets to be exhausting for people, right? And for all kinds of ways and reasons. And so just being more thoughtful about what is, to someone's point in the chat, what is productivity, and how will I be most productive? And does that really mean I have to be online, or does it mean I should be doing it in some other way? And to Carmel's point, maybe it means I want and need to have a little more social interaction. So it doesn't even need to be a work activity at all, right? It could be some sort of activity that helps me get a little more social with my teammates in a way that we all feel good about, right? However that can be done depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah, I think it's important to model things like going for a walk or taking 10 minutes to meditate, making sure that that is okay. Again, the things that are harder to tangibly measure, there are plenty of studies about the benefits of nature and meditation and whatnot. I think we're starting to hear those conversations within organizations, but there's still probably some aversion, like, I can't measure that.
No, Becca, but I think that it's a terrific point, because we have an HR executive meeting on a weekly basis, and we start those meetings, or during the meeting at some point, we ask questions like that. Like, hey, tell us how you remove stress in your day, and share with us like one activity that you do each day that gives you energy, right? And so everybody will pipe up and start to talk about how they walk their dogs or how they did this. And you can just see the energy level in people's faces as they talk about these activities. And of course, people are sharing, and then other people are thinking, oh, wow, why didn't I think of doing that? I should do that. And it's just a great way, to help everybody anchor back in what is really important, right? Which is staying healthy and well. And but also just to energize the group a little bit more, and to bring it, all back to just real life, I think is always important.
I love that, Karen. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah. I would sort of say to that, Karen, too, is sometimes you actually have to schedule like literally 15 minutes into your morning somewhere and into your afternoon, just so that you do walk away from whatever you're doing, because I found I now have to do it. Whereas when I went into the office, somebody always turned up at your door at some point, just to swing by and say hello, or to just say, oh, did you know such and such is happening? And it kind of was the break. But you also had that thing of, if you left your office to go to a physical meeting room, you got up, you moved, and you kind of left some things behind. But I find I now have to stick 15 minutes in my calendar in the morning and in the afternoon. Otherwise, it does become this iteration that you kind of do. I mean, I've gone from having lunch with somebody to literally that 5-minute grab a coffee, and if you can manage to get a salad into a bowl in 5 minutes, and then I come back and eat it in front of my laptop. So not such a good plan. So and I think we need to be more conscious of it, because I think longer term, the issue is that, you end up with these pains in your shoulders, you end up feeling tired. The kind of buzz you would have gotten from working at home before, where I might have gotten up and said, oh, great, I can get up tomorrow and I don't have to worry what I look like, because I'm effectively working from home. I'm only going to be on calls, and you can only see me from here up, has kind of become, oh, tomorrow is just I'm working. It's not it's not a different feeling of a day, this kind of constant working from home. The other thing that I have discovered is I do need to get into clothes that I would have worn going to work. So I kind of, for the first bit, I was getting up and kind of getting into t-shirt and, sweatpants and whatever. And now I find that also allows me to break that sense that when I step away, I get out of the blouse and the trousers, and I get into, something that I'll go and walk the dog with. And I didn't think I'd ever need to do that. So I think there's a whole conscious stream of how we're plugged in, and how we need to unplug, and how we need to take those time out, and that we're only learning because we're all in the scenario where we're working now maybe 5 days a week at home. So
yeah, and just to add something in there, so we on the Microsoft side, so for those of you that use Teams, right, we have a product called Teams, and it's very similar to Zoom, and so we've actually, based on all that we're talking about here, we've started to build in, for example, we launched probably about a month ago, what we call a virtual commute. So if you're in Teams, it actually helps you basically kind of unplug, right, and reflect and get yourself ready for the workday, just as if you were commuting, right, if you like you used to do in the car. And then we have you of course have the same thing at the end of your workday. So it puts your mindset back into going with your family now, having dinner, right? Just like, again, if you were commuting. So the virtual commute is interesting. It'll be, to Halani's point earlier, it'll be great to see the data, right, on what difference it makes. We've also forged a relationship with a company called Headspace. And so within Teams, there are now going to be mindfulness and well-being resources and tools, because I think we're all right? We're all right here that it can't constantly be this nonstop online meeting type of environment. And so, but how do you use some of the tools and resources that people will be using anyway to help facilitate and foster this way of thinking and being, as almost like a change management effort, right? And so, we'll get the data at some point and be able to report back on how it goes.
Yeah, the thing I was thinking about as you all are talking about this, and this is very fascinating to me, is you hear about, I don't know, I just monitor, I read an article from time to time about employee wellness programs, and sometimes they give out, wearables, even some larger companies, and things like that. And I was curious about curious about whether you all had heard about or were part of any such deployments. The Headspace Microsoft partnership, if that's the right word, but your all's integration of that tool. There's an example that's really interesting. It came up organically. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other ones that people have heard about that they want to mention, but I'd love to round up this information and we can share it, in the follow-up report basically that we do for IGF on this session. I think that'd be really valuable.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. And for people to, people that are participating at this point to also share, because I'm sure that there's so many people that have ideas, or they're trying things within their companies or within their government nonprofit organizations. So it'd be terrific to learn broadly what people are seeing and doing and what's working. If we have evidence, that's terrific. We're always up for sharing, for sure.
I know that there is one program that's currently running in Ireland, and I just can't remember off the top of my head who organized it, but any company can join, and it's about logging your steps. So it's trying to encourage people to get away from the desk, get outside. Yeah, and I see Karen and some others nodding. So obviously it's popular and it's out there across the board, but it does, I suppose, kind of force people to get a little exercise and step out. So. Well,
I think, I don't know who made the point earlier, but I do think it's very much about modeling as well. So if we're the leader in a meeting, to ask that question or to talk about what we did that morning or how we're going to go and use our next 30 minutes to take a walk, or, I think it sends the signal that it's okay, right? That we don't expect to see people online every minute of every day.
Okay. Well, I realized we've got about 15 minutes left. And I had one question related. I think this has kind of briefly come up. It's sort of a challenge, but but really interested in everybody's perspectives on it. But I do want to just put a pin in something. I know that before we break on a session, IGF wants us to each of the panelists to briefly talk about one or more commitments that they have or initiatives that they have underway that maybe you mentioned already and just want to reiterate, or something that you haven't mentioned, for the year 2021 that's related to our themes. Just want to make sure we don't leave IGF hanging with that. But before we get to that's maybe a good way to close when we get there. But one of the challenges probably, is with more work being conducted remotely, is, that there's more, that is essentially a broader attack vector, right? For breaches, for cybersecurity incidents, for breaches of privacy, separate but maybe related might be perceptions by the employee of surveillance, and I'm not calling workplace surveillance per se, a privacy breach or something like that. I just want to make sure I'm not saying that. But I just wondered how do you all think about that challenge, those challenges, and how do you recommend addressing them? And from an organizational perspective, from a government, is there a role for governments, for example?
Okay, Brian. Okay, I'll start. It's actually a huge area. Once we go to working from home, we have such a mixture of people maybe using their own devices, they don't have that, that inherent security that exists once they're sitting in the organization. So I think from an organizational point of view, it's really important that, standards, I suppose, are set within the organization around devices, around security, around VPNs. And that, when you look at most of the security breaches that happen, the majority of them are still, because people click on links that they shouldn't click on, that, some of those really bigger attacks that hit an organization, are more rare, let's say, than those small fundamental things. So kind of education is really important on an ongoing basis. And then I think we need to certainly look at the implications of working from home and, data that somebody prints off and leaves, on their office desk at home, access to devices, maybe using devices. And I know right now in Ireland, you can't go to a restaurant or you can't go to a coffee shop. But, if you work from home, does that mean that people will go and use their laptop maybe at a cafe or a restaurant? So I think there's a whole education process that needs to happen around, now that you've separated from the organization from a physical perspective, that we need to look at what the implications for security, and that is a huge area. And on the one of the kind of workplace surveillance piece, I think there certainly is that sense that if you're connected all day, that, your organization can tell when you got online and when you got offline at some stage during the day. So I think it's important, I suppose, again, and it's back to a point I think that Karen and others on this discussion had earlier, is that, people need breaks. And if you start at 7 o'clock in the morning, maybe you finish at 12 and you don't come back online till 2. I think once the organization understands and people understand that that's okay, that once you're getting your work done, the quality is there, there isn't an issue, that people aren't going to be monitoring your on time and your off time throughout the day. And I don't think organizations necessarily have the time or overall the interest to do that sort of, I think they've bigger issues really to be worrying about in the grand scheme of things. So that would be my quick, comment. I shut myself off before I finish it. They would be my comments on that.
I don't even know how nowadays we can run even knowledge organizations that rely on clocking in and clocking out. As Carmel says, we are very lucky. We've always thought of deliverables, quality, and, sort of peer-reviewed processes and so on and so forth. But we face another particular challenge in addition to, I agree with everything Carmel said. Where you store your data, the security around it, these are all complicated by working from home. And in many developing countries, it's the office laptop that's actually going to be used by children for their online lessons as well, at least a couple of times a day. So it's not even you working in a coffee shop, it's also other people in your house using your work laptop. And why not? Because it's, got downtime. So, it is a resource. But that presents another set of challenges. And then we work with user data, sometimes incredibly personal user data. We do lots of ethnographic studies. We work with call detail records with, trillions of phone calls made to identify mobility patterns, for example. So not only, of course, should they be pseudonymized and so on and in central servers, but now when we work remotely, what do we do? Do we give access even remotely to our servers, or do we have policies like only a random sample can be examined at any particular time, not enough to, really reveal anything particularly useful? Then what's the point? Then in talking to users, we can no longer go to people's houses to do household surveys across Asia, Africa, so then what the digital presents an opportunity, but also a huge challenge, because how do you interview households that are not connected to understand how they are working? We can't, and this is a real challenge we are facing at the moment. But on the opportunity side, what we've decided, for example, in Sri Lanka, in the district that went into the first official curfew, is sign up for 2 weeks, a whole lot of respondents who they get to select what photos they send at the end of every day to reflect what their life under lockdown is like. And that's a whole other different way of doing ethnographic research, right? So it presents different opportunities. While it's a huge challenge that we can't observe them working or child caring at home, they are sending a stream of photos voluntarily because they've signed up for a study. Now it's a different look, but these are the kinds of sort of innovative ways we have to think about user research in these pandemics.
I think there are so many layers to this. Just to add one more thing, you know, when we start peeling back the onion, when we talk about bring your own device to work and bring your own software, in many cases, terms and conditions policies, how many people are even reading those? They're so complicated. They're not in language that non-lawyers can even understand. So what impact does that have on all the things that we're downloading that might not even be for our work, and how data is shared between those kinds of platforms? So it's big.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. So to that, kind of thing that I teed up there about maybe mentioning, you know, some commitments and stuff. Maybe I could even the question a little bit more broader, because it'd be really interesting to hear what you all think. But if you could wave a magic wand, what's a change from a government, you know, regulation perspective, perhaps, you know, that you think would help better harness the opportunity of remote working and improve outcomes for all workers and businesses? And then, you know, maybe as part of that, we could try and address that question that IGF wants all of us to answer here about any voluntary commitments or activities that you all have for the coming year that you want to share with the community and call people to action to.
Okay, I'll go. I'm a researcher. I sort of live to bring evidence-based, you know, evidence to policymakers. I would really love rich labor data, the kind that the OECD has, which helps us understand task compositions, the level of face-to-face interactions, the level of automation, ICT use in different categories of jobs. So we can have a real conversation about what jobs can be done from whom, who that disadvantages or advantages, and work with employers and governments to creating more equitable and sustainable jobs, some of which might be at home, some of which might not be at home, but we need information.
My magic wand item is more from the private sector perspective. I'm new to the regulatory side, so I'm still learning about that, but I would love to see a paradigm shift in the employer-employee relationship. So thinking more about as an employer as an entire ecosystem that needs to provide everything that an employee needs to be their best self out in the world. And that includes things like designing equity, the core to every single process from start to finish. Not just performative justice statements, but really going deep to do that work.
Okay, so for me, and we talked about it a lot, it would be internet access and broadband. And the reason I picked that is that it impacts so many people, that it's not just the working person, but it's society. It's impacting our education system. And certainly in Ireland, what we discovered when COVID hit and you know, schools were closed, you know, people's access, children's access to education was severely hampered. Now, you know, we managed to get there in terms, but there is so much more that needs to be done. And I think that broadband and internet access is just a fundamental across the board for so many people.
Yes, and I agree with Carmel. I mean, I'll respond based on two of the initiatives that Microsoft has underway that I believe are particularly well aligned to all that we're talking about today. One I mentioned earlier was Airband, right, where we are helping bring internet connectivity and broadband to rural populations that otherwise would be underserved. And so that's been underway and will continue into the future. And so that's one I'm particularly proud of, and I think, again, aligns really well. The other one is skills, because when somebody has access, that's excellent. But if they don't have the skills to be part of the digital economy, then that's barrier number two, right? And so we're also very focused on skills, and we announced a little bit earlier this year the commitment to skilling 25 million people in these future digital skills. So everything ranging from, artificial intelligence and data analytics, data science, those types of skills, to some that are even more technical. And I think that helps people with employability. It also helps people be better digital workers for those of us that will be working virtually some or all of the time. So those are two of the Microsoft focus areas that should help in many ways people around the world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I just to put a bow on our discussion here. I really don't. I can't imagine how this could have gone better. I think that the diversity here in perspectives is so key, and everything that you all have shared. It's so interesting to see the dotted and even solid lines between the different perspectives and viewpoints and experiences here that really span the globe. And I'm glad you mentioned, actually, just to do a little bit to mention something that's been of high interest to me. There a little moderator's prerogative here, Karen, that you mentioned earlier on, is that television white spaces technology or airband technology, because that's been, for my own organization, which is a advocate, a not-for-profit advocate for small businesses that are basically software developers and some connected device manufacturers. I couldn't agree from that perspective. I couldn't agree more with what you just said, and Carmel just said, especially about the broadband infrastructure needed to support these kind of capabilities. And I know that's been brought up, I think, by everybody earlier on. And there's and it's very true. It's very true that I apologize for not remembering exactly who mentioned this earlier, but that, sometimes there's a perception that even in developed countries that there's just widespread access to broadband, when there are still many underserved communities across all kinds of countries, whether they're categorized as developed or developing, and I'm aware, and so that enables the members of our association. So we're excited about that. But the television white spaces or airband technology, which has very broad reach, it utilizes TV broadcast spectrum and penetrates buildings well and things like that, is a pretty exciting thing. And I know that there's been a number of some pretty compelling use cases and deployments around the world. I think that there's one that I recall from, I believe from, I could be wrong about the country. I know it's in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think it's Zimbabwe. I want to say it's Zimbabwe, where it was it was focused on home education, but very similar issues there, and interesting data coming out from that. It's just something that that we're particularly excited about. So I was pretty jazzed to hear it come up. But as I was saying, I am excited to have held this conversation here today, and thank you to all the participants. I mean, we basically had almost no attrition, and a high number of participants here in this session, and lots of engagement in the chat, lots of Q&A that we were able to get through all of, which is really excellent. So I think from an IGF, perspective, that's ideal. I will make sure to all our audience members, I'll make sure to follow up with all the panelists and we'll round up this information that we've been talking about, because I think there seems to be very high interest in learning about, for example, each of your efforts and programs, the blog from, I think you mentioned from Kathleen Hogan, Karen, those kinds of things. We'll make sure to round up all that information and distribute it. But thank you all. I realize we're kind of at time here. I really again for me, my organization, and I feel safe saying on behalf of the IGF, thank you all for participating here, to all our session panelists. And I'd love to maybe people give a virtual round of applause to us all, but much appreciated, and we'll get our report out soon, and thank you all, everyone, for being a part of the IGF community.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Brian.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.